All right, there we go. Welcome, everybody. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Cooperatives First is located on Treaty 6 territory, the home of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis nations. We acknowledge that this land was not ceded, but that the purpose of the treaties was to ensure the land would be shared. I recognize that on a virtual call like this, there's folks from all across Turtle Island, so I encourage you to take a moment and acknowledge the people and ancestors of the place that you call home. Okay, I'm going to share my screen with y'all, and we'll talk about annual reporting, AGMs, the fun stuff. Okay, hope everyone can see that okay. Okay, so just a quick overview. We'll start off with some of those formal requirements, the year-end requirements that every co-op has to comply with each annual year. Then we'll talk about just a couple pro tips, some ideas that we've seen used over the years by big and small co-ops that make things a little bit easier, better engage the membership, and can sometimes lead to better outcomes for co-ops. We'll wrap up with some helpful resources for those that are planning a meeting or are maybe starting a new co-op, and then we'll have a good Q&A where you can ask those burning questions. Let's get into it. So, year-end requirements. AGM season is upon us. So I think most folks on the call, if you're part of a cooperative, you're probably working through at least one of these at the moment. But largely, if we think of the timeline for your annual reporting requirements, it really kicks off with fiscal year end. Now, for most co-ops, that's going to be December 31st. So usually that's the starting point. And then we've got things like paying the cooperative's taxes, if applicable, preparing the annual report, maybe engaging an auditor, holding the annual general meeting, and filing your annual return. Let's go through each of those in turn. And again, for those who've just joined us, if you've got a question, please do feel free to fire it through the chat. My coworker Riley here at Cooperatives First is going to monitor the chat, but also jot it down. We'll make time for some questions later in the workshop. Okay, so it's year end, December 31st for most co-ops. Now what? It's at that point where it's up to the board of directors, or if you have one, a manager and bookkeeper, to finalize the books of the co-op. You're going to close the books on the previous fiscal year, ensure that all of your revenue and expenses are in order, and you're going to work towards preparing your annual compilation. And the goal of that is to work towards producing a clear balance sheet and an operating statement for that fiscal year. Those are the two key requirements that all co-ops need to produce for their memberships, is a balance sheet and an operating statement. It's also at this time that I'd recommend your board of directors reach out to auditors. If it's your first AGM, the board may have to source a couple and see who's available and maybe get quotes. But if you're not new at the game and your membership have already appointed an auditor from the previous fiscal year, I'd recommend just after year end, giving them a heads up saying, hey, what's your schedule look like? This is our timeline for getting you the books. Does that work? And some folks may be a little bit panicked by what I've just said. So to audit or not? By far and away, most of the cooperatives we work with here at Cooperatives First do not have to undergo audits. And that's because most legislation provides the option for co-ops to waive the appointment of their auditor. Now, if you exceed certain revenue levels, for example, for federal companies, if you exceed $1 million in revenue, you need to undergo a full audit. But each province handles this a little bit differently. And again, most of the co-ops that we're working with, which are most of those on the call, are fairly small in nature. and there's only certain conditions where you would need to undergo an audit. So in Manitoba, this applies to an audit's only required for distributing cooperatives, largely those that have outstanding securities, usually then to non-members. In Saskatchewan, Section 133 of the Act deals with this, and largely, if your co-op has 20 or more members, if it's receiving a significant portion of its revenue from government funds, if it's soliciting donations from the public, or if it's a consumer co-op, those are all criteria where you may require an audit. In Alberta, distributing cooperatives must undergo audits, again, like Manitoba. Those are for co-ops with outstanding securities. In British Columbia, Section 109 of the Cooperative Associations Act and Regulation 2 of the Regulations to the Co-ops Act governs whether or not you need an audit, and largely it's to do with if the co-op's a reporting association, which has to do with the nature of the business and the number of members in the registrar's opinion. What I've found in practice is most co-ops default to waiving the audit. So you can waive the appointment of an auditor until such time as the registrar says you need to. Similar in for the Federal Co-ops Act, the Canadian Cooperatives Act for federal co-ops is if you don't have outstanding securities, you can usually waive the appointment of an auditor. Now, the caveat to all of that is if a granting agency or a bank asks that you provide audited financial statements. In those cases, you need to undergo an auditor. Similarly, if you are working with a securities agency and they also ask that you provide audited financial statements, again, you would need to then. But broadly or not, broadly, most co-ops can waive the appointment of an auditor. Okay, tax filing. Another question we get all the time at Cooperative Service, should we be paying taxes? My answer, almost always, maybe. So let's get into that a little bit. When do cooperatives usually file their taxes? Usually it takes place before your AGM, largely because most co-ops will report that in their financials, the amount of taxes that they're paying from that previous fiscal year. Cooperatives are subject to small business or corporate tax rates, depending on the level of net income generated by the co-op. I think it differs a little bit with one or two provinces, but usually the threshold is $500,000. If you're paying if your net incomes are above $500,000, you're subject to corporate tax on that higher amount. But most co-ops are paying small business tax, which at the federal level, I believe, is 9%. And then different provinces have their additional percentage on top of that. And the mechanism used for filing your taxes as a cooperative is a T2. Now, most of the cooperatives we've worked with, especially if you're a very small co-op, if you're still in your startup phase, more often than not, you can use the T2 short form, which is designed for nonprofit organizations. CRA wants that information from companies. They want to know how much revenue is generated each year by all companies. And so if you're still in your early stages, you're only collecting dribs and drabs of money, I would still recommend filing a T2 short form, even if you have no profit. If there's a co-op that has some operations, you're doing things, maybe you're selling a little bit, or you're incurring expenses, you can certainly still file a T2 form. Often in the trade, that's called a T2 nil if you have no income while operating. But if you're not operating, and many of our co-ops do this, they incorporate, and then they kind of have to sit in a bit of a purgatory where they're either just doing member recruitment, they're doing a little bit of marketing, they're doing things that don't really see the exchange of dollars. In those cases where you're not doing any sort of financial operating, then you can postpone filing a T2. Now, I'm going to say that with a caveat, talk to a bookkeeper. This isn't my area of expertise. For bookkeeping and accounting things, I always consult our contracted bookkeeper, but generally, these are the high-level notes. Most co-ops should be filing a T2, a short T2, because most of them don't have enough income to file a full T2. Okay. So once you got all of that squared away, you've figured out your auditing situation, you've paid your taxes, you've generated those financial reports, you can prepare the co-op's annual report that goes to the membership. Now, at a bare minimum, your annual report has to contain these two financial statements. It has to contain the balance sheet, and it has to contain the operating statement, both for that previous fiscal year. If your co-op is more than 1 year old, you have to provide that year-over-year comparison. And if you've undergone an audit, a review engagement, a notice to reader, then you've also got to provide that third party's written report with those financial statements to the membership. A big question we get a lot about the annual report is who's responsible for preparing that? The board. At the end of the day, all of these things fall back to the board of directors, and the annual report is one of the accountability tools the members use to hold the board accountable. The board's responsible for preparing that annual report, providing it to the members as a way of demonstrating what they've been up to this past year and portraying the financial health of the co-op. Now, do you need to become an expert in QuickBooks and the production of financial reports? No. You can certainly contract a bookkeeper, contract an accountant, hire somebody who has that skill set, but it's just the board who's responsible for overseeing that process and making that presentation to the membership. So that's your annual report at a minimum. Now, lots of organizations will go beyond that minimum. The balance sheet and the operating statement and the year-over-year comparison, that's the minimum requirement per co-op legislation. But there's other things that co-ops can include. And if you're thinking about including additional things, I'd recommend asking around the board table, what should members know? And it wouldn't hurt, I would say, to poll your members. What information do you need from the board of directors to know what the co-op's doing, whether it's in good health, and what would give you the information and resources to really make a call on how the co-op's performing? What do you need to know as the membership? Whoop. And there's a few things that are commonly included. One of them, I should have mentioned here, is a cash flow statement. Some organizations, just because they're using the software anyway, can generate a statement of cash flows. And that can be a better way of showing the financial health of the co-op from a cash position, rather than just an operational or asset liability position. You can also provide written reports. It's not uncommon for members to receive the financial statements of the co-op and not necessarily have the expertise to discern the health of the co-op from those statements. And so a written report, which is literally on paper, or one that could be delivered at the AGM by a member of the board or a manager, could be used to help contextualize those financials. I would a lot of the organizations I've been a part of, I like to provide a president's report or an operations report that at least gives at least one page, a summary of what the co-op's major activities have been like, a written statement that speaks to the finances of the co-op and our financial health, just to give members a little bit extra to help understand the numbers, understand what we did that produced those numbers. And if there are risks or concerns, it might be worth noting those as well. Or similarly, if there's major achievements and major successes, note those as well and help the members understand the numbers. And then for co-ops that are a little further along in their life cycle, you may be striking committees. And if so, those committees may be doing important work. You may consider adding committee reports to your annual general meeting. Finance, membership, sustainability, nominations, governance, maintenance, if applicable. Those are some common ones. I've been part of housing organizations in the past. We would often have a board report, a treasurer's report that really got into the finances, and a property and maintenance report that spoke to the well-being of the asset we collectively owned. So again, cater your annual report to what the co-op does and what the members need to know. And similarly, if you've hired staff that are on the front lines doing the work of the co-op, interacting maybe with your members on a day-to-day basis or with your customers, consider including a manager's report or a CEO report, just because they're going to have maybe a slightly different take on the business than the board of directors. They could offer some good insight directly then to the membership. So you have your balance sheet, your operating statement, and then anything else the board deems appropriate that can be delivered in paper to the membership, as well as in a presentation by the board. And then we come to the annual meeting. AGM season's upon us. I'm seeing lots of notices going out, and attended our first AGM of the season just last week. I always like AGMs a lot. It's a good time to engage your members, discuss the co-op, reflect on the year that was, and ask questions. So when do we call the annual general meeting? Depending on the province you're located in, you're going to call that meeting within 4 to 6 months of year end. And you need to notify all members of the co-op. And if you've issued investment shares in your co-op, you also need to notify your investment shareholders. What does that look like? Now, I know from all the co-ops that we've worked with that the notice period is in your bylaws. So check your bylaws for the specifics. But in the Cooperatives Acts across the provinces, here's the guidelines. 21 to 50 days is by far the most common in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and the Canada Cooperatives Act. In BC, you need to give at least 7 days, but I know most of the co-ops that we work with provide at least 14 days notice. And in Alberta as well, 10 to 60 days notice is the guidelines. And the manner of notice that you give is largely at the discretion of the board of directors. Obviously, sending out a mass email is the most common, but for co-ops that have a larger membership, you're going to have things like bounce backs and incorrect emails. That's just going to be part of the business. It's often helpful, and most legislation will recommend this, that you post notice of the AGM at the co-op's registered office or at the places where it does business. Now, in particular, our consumer co-ops that operate grocery stores, things like that, that's often a preferred method there, in addition to sending out email if possible. Any other method is at the discretion of the board of directors. Social media obviously is becoming more popular. Some co-ops I think still do mail, which is great, but that's at the discretion of the board. And so we come to the annual general meeting. What is it we need to be deciding? Now, there's some fairly procedural things. And if you check out, I'll provide a link later on to our AGM planning tools. That includes a sample agenda. So there's some fairly procedural things around minute taking, as well as approval of the agenda that need to take place. If you've attended a meeting of any kind, you're familiar with it. But largely, if we're talking about the AGM, there's 3 big decisions that have to take place at every annual meeting. And the reason those take place is because they're related to the members of the co-op holding the board of directors accountable. And so these are the 3 resolutions that every co-op has to have. You have to have a resolution to approve the annual report. So the board presents that annual report. Maybe they have a presentation about it. Maybe members get to ask questions on the contents of the annual report, but you have to have a resolution to approve the annual report. Also at the AGM, you should have an election of directors. Often co-ops will do a call for nominations before the annual report, the annual meeting, but some will take nominations from the floor of the AGM. Again, check your bylaws to make sure you're following the process that you've set out in your bylaws. It's also very common that elections for co-op boards are not competitive. That's totally fine. In that case, you would normally have a resolution to appoint the directors elected by acclamation. Largely just meaning they've ran unopposed, there's space on the board for them, they have been declared elected by acclamation. Now, if there is a competitive election, well, again, you need to follow your bylaws and follow the process that's set out in the bylaws for the election of directors. Most co-ops will provide for the creation of a ballot, which suggests a paper ballot or some sort of digital one. Again, it's up to the board to set up the process to administer the bylaws at the AGM. And finally, the third resolution you need to have is the appointment of the auditor or waiving the appointment of the auditor. An auditor really acts as a check on the board of directors. It provides an external, independent third party who will review the reporting of the board and provide that to the members. So it's the members who have to appoint the auditor, and they do so at the fiscal year prior to the one that they'll be auditing. So right now, if we're appointing our auditors in, say, March 2024, that is the auditor you're appointing to review fiscal year 2024 at the AGM that will take place in 2025. Or if you're not requiring an auditor, then you would have a resolution to waive the appointment of the auditor, and that has to be made by the membership. Now, other resolutions you may have may be things that are required in your bylaws. It's not uncommon for co-ops to require a budget to go to the membership. That's perfectly fine. Or if there's a significant amount of borrowing that takes place. If, say, a lot of co-ops will have, if the board wants to borrow above $100,000, they need consent of the membership. That could be added on to the AGM. And then anything that's considered a special resolution requires the consent of the membership and usually requires a supermajority, a 2/3. Usually that's then put to the members. So things like an amalgamation, removal of directors, or amending the bylaws or articles, those are special resolutions and they can take place often at the AGM. One of the things we generally advise is at least once a year, the board should do a good thorough read through of their bylaws and note things that ought to be changed, and then make those changes at your AGM so you can kind of get a twofer. So in a nutshell, that's your AGM. Not so scary, right? And then once your AGM takes place, you've ticked the box of reporting to your members. Now you need to then report to the provincial or federal government where you've registered and let them know that, well, one, we're still active as a cooperative, and two, we've done our compliance measures. So the annual return is filed with provincial governments within 1 or 2 months of the AGM. If you check your corporate registry account, the due date is usually listed, so you can always file it on time. When you file the annual return, you'll be able to update your corporate information. So if you've moved offices and you want your mail directed to a different place, or you've changed email addresses, lots of folks, of course, will register their cooperative with a personal email address, and then once they're active, they'll create an email for their co-op. Updating that sort of thing can often be done when you file your annual return. Additionally, you'll be asked to confirm your meeting compliance. So you'll need to tick a box and provide the date for when your AGM was held. And you'll be given a chance to update your director information. So often, again, because co-ops are having elections at their AGMs, the people who are on the board of directors will change, so you can remove and add those directors providing their information. And then different provinces will ask for different things. But generally, you should have your annual report with you when you're filing your annual return. For instance, you may need to upload a PDF of your annual report. In Saskatchewan, you actually need to input the high-level items from your annual report. So that includes your assets, your liabilities, your equity, your revenue, and your expenses. So have that information available and ready to go. You'll also need to indicate whether or not you've appointed an auditor or if the members have dispensed with it. And then you have to pay a fee. I believe it's just $20 to $40. It varies a little bit by province, but nothing onerous. And that's it. Much of what goes into those annual compliance measures is what I consider self-regulation. Is incumbent upon the members of the co-op to hold the board of directors accountable and ensure they're complying with the requirements placed on them by the Cooperatives Act. Letting the government know this is largely a formality. It ensures that you're still active and it updates your records with them. But I don't think the government goes about checking every little detail. They largely leave that up to the co-ops and the membership. And then finally, once you've ticked all the boxes associated with year end, make sure all these things find their way into the cooperative's minute book. If you've been working with us, I always recommend, once you've incorporated, create a minute book, whether that's a Dropbox, a Google Drive, a SharePoint, or a folder in someone's office. Make sure you're hanging on to the records of the co-op. If you hop on our website, Co-op Creator, just Google record keeping, and you'll find a resource called Everything You Need to Know About Managing Records. And that provides a pretty comprehensive list of what you need and why. But largely from this process, you're going to want to hang on to your AGM meeting minutes. Take a note of the attendance record at your AGM, just in case you get a challenge about quorum down the road. You're also going to want to hang on to the annual report that was prepared by the board and presented to the members. You're going to need the information about the auditor and their report. You'll need to update your director information if there was any turnover on your board of directors. You'll want the annual return receipt that you received when you submitted to the government, and you'll want your tax filing. All of that should go into your annual report, again, categorized based on how you've set it up. But again, that can be as easy as adding it to a SharePoint or a Dropbox or a Google Drive. But make sure you're hanging on to those records. Okay, we're kind of at the halfway point, and we're making pretty good time. Let's do a quick pause and take a few questions. We've talked about kind of the nuts and bolts, the need to knows of AGMs and annual reporting. We can tackle a few questions here. And I will say, I did have 2 questions that were submitted ahead of time, which I do appreciate, because I can always fact check myself. But one of those questions was, can you set the number of directors at the AGM? Most co-ops will set a range in their articles of incorporation. Often, if you've worked with us, again, my recommendation is always between 3 and 9. If it provides so in your bylaws, the members can pass a resolution to set or fix the number of directors within that range. So for example, we may decide we're going to fix the number of directors at 5. And that way then, if we have 9 people running, well, we have to have an election, even though the number is higher. Most co-ops tend not to. Most co-ops say, if you want to serve on the board, come one, come all. Another question I had is there a recommended software or process for counting votes? I would say in my experience, the most common process is a piece of paper and a box. and then usually you have a member or two counting ballots. Generally, I would recommend not having a board member, at least not having a board member who's up for election counting ballots, just to keep everything above board. But largely, when it comes to voting at an annual meeting, the advice I've had from lawyers is as long as the will of the membership can be expressed, then the directors can put a system in place that they feel is appropriate. Always follow your bylaws. So check what your bylaws say about voting, and then find a system that works. Lots of co-ops, especially those with larger memberships, will use clickers. So they'll use some sort of software like Lumio. Some applications like Zoom or WebEx especially, I think is a little bit better, have some built-in voting mechanisms. If you can use those and members can reasonably access that with no issue, that's all perfectly fine. Yeah, so it's up to the board, but make sure it works and make sure it's in keeping with what's set out in your bylaws. And I see we have a couple of questions. First question. What is a non-distributing co-op? A non-distributing co-op generally, check provincial legislation for the exact definition, generally is a co-op that doesn't have outstanding securities. Broadly, investment shares or large amounts of capital that it's raised from its owners. Yeah, but broadly, and then some acts will make the distinction between those issued to the public versus the membership. But broadly, we're talking about the issuance of securities. Yes, a non-distributing co-op. The question was it that a non-distributing co-op does or does not need to appoint an auditor? In Alberta, which I believe you're asking from, a non-distributing co-op can waive the appointment of an auditor, so they don't need to undergo an audit. Ramona asks, how about out-of-town members not being able to come but want to vote or make comments? Great question. Great question. And in particular, the pandemic really shined a light on this, because most co-op legislation made reference to a time and a place for the annual meeting, which suggests you're having that in person and you're having it at a physical place. And when we were on lockdown, boy, that's a no-no. And so most registrars issued emergency notices that provided for online meetings. And now most governments are updating legislation, not just co-ops, but also nonprofits and business companies or corporations to reflect the availability of online or hybrid meetings. If you've been working with us, generally we try to word your bylaws or your rules of association to include the option to have online meetings or allow for electronic attendance or telephone attendance. And then it's really up to the board to find the system that works. So whether that's using something like Zoom or having a conference call, it's up to you. But broadly, you can use some sort of online system to make it work. And then if there's someone who simply can't attend the AGM, in most cases, tough, just because it's hard to accommodate everyone's requests. But some co-ops will allow for certain things to take place before the AGM. So whether that's allowing members to vote in advance by mailing in ballots, or submitting questions to directors in advance, that's up to you. Check your bylaws or your rules of association to see what's permissible. And then it's up to the directors to handle that process. Sue asks, do you have standard wording for these resolutions? Absolutely. If you go to coopcreator.ca and you Google 3 resolutions, you'll see a tool very cleverly called 3 resolutions every co-op needs for their AGM. And yeah, we provide some sample wording there. Additionally, I think we have one tool for if it's your first AGM, and depending on where you're located, you may be approving your bylaws. And so we've also got wording for that as well. Can you repeat where to find record keeping information? Yes. Co-opcreator.ca. We'll share a link later on, or I think maybe Riley can drop it in the chat. Just co-opcreator.ca. That's Cooperatives First's resource website. All the tools that we've built are located on there, and it's really an A to Z guide for starting a co-op. But there's a ton of tools and templates and how-tos for boards of directors, just to make sure that they stay on top of everything. So you'll find everything there from minute taking to record keeping to planning your AGM. Will the recording be shared later? Yes, 100%. Hey, any other questions from folks?
Kyle, I got one directly sent to me that maybe you could answer.
Mhm.
Just give me 1 second here. Is it still recommended to engage someone to do a review when it comes time to audit, maybe even if the co-op can waive that opportunity?
Mm. I mean, that's a good question, and it is one we get asked a lot. And a lot of our co-ops do wrestle with that a bit, largely because it's a little daunting to be the last line of who's providing that report. It's up to you. There's a few considerations to have there. One, as a board, would it give you more peace of mind to have an accountant or someone like that review your books? If yes, sure, go for it. Two, can you afford it? Undergoing a review and certainly undergoing an audit is expensive. Depending on the nature of your business and the number of transactions you're recording, you're going to be you're looking probably at several $1,000s. I was on the board of a nonprofit housing organization, and at the time, before we found a smaller semi-retired service provider, our annual audit was in the neighborhood of $3,500. So it's not egregious, but for a small company that's growing, it is a bit. So if you can work your networks and try and find someone that's more cost effective or affordable, you don't necessarily have to use one of the big five firms like Ernst & Young or KPMG. You can find possibly better pricing locally. So again, if you're not comfortable just providing the annual report on your own, and you can afford it, then sure, you certainly could undergo an audit. Yeah. Any other questions before we shift gears? Oh, see some in the chat. Okay, all good. Oh, thank you, Sandra, for sharing the record keeping tool. Much appreciated. Okay, any other chats before we get into some pro tips? All good. Okay, let's keep on going. So we've kind of covered the nuts and bolts, the basics of what is involved with year end and annual reporting. Let's talk about a couple tips. And again, a lot of these come from doing. We've worked with co-ops at Cooperatives First for the past 8 years. Most of us have been involved with co-ops and other organizations for decades. You really hone your craft by doing these stuff, finding what works, and building systems and processes into your co-op. So here's just some things I've found are helpful to consider if you're on the board and you're looking at maybe engaging your members or getting better participation. The first one is get your members involved. Co-ops are membership-based organizations. And a lot of co-ops want people involved in some way. And not everyone wants to serve on a board of directors. There's a certain connotation, I think, that comes with sitting on a board of directors that doesn't appeal to lots of folks. So why not get them involved by planning your AGM? They probably shouldn't be doing things like meeting with your auditor. You probably want to leave that to the board. But when it comes to booking a venue, preparing some food, finding entertainment, maybe getting a guest speaker, why not? Have your members help out with posting flyers in the co-op storefront, or creating the craft cards or building something in Canva. Get your members involved in helping the board with the duties of building the AGM. Another one is when you put out a call for directors, why not also put out a call for the members that want to sit on committees? As your co-op grows, it'll be very helpful to create committees to support the board with specific operations, be it membership, finance, HR, what have you. Why not make a seat or two on each of those committees that allow members to get more involved? Increasingly, we're seeing lots of more established co-ops allow for people to be on the board of directors for a trial run. They allow for one or two people to serve on the board, not as a voting director, but largely on a trial run to mentor them to become a future board member. Similarly, lots of smaller co-ops will have members serving on committees, kind of as a trial run, dipping your toe in the governance of the cooperative, and then maybe they'll become your future board of directors. So why not put out a call for both? And another great way of getting the participation is start the conversation sooner. So as soon as you have that annual report, make it available to your members so that they can review the report in advance of the AGM. They can formulate some questions. They can maybe consult a friend or something to help them understand what's in that annual report, and they can come better prepared. That may seem daunting if you're on the board of directors, but the purpose of the AGM is for the members to hold the board accountable. You want questions. You want members coming out and sharing their thoughts and opinion. Those are all signs that your cooperative and the democratic nature of a cooperative is functioning well. So something to consider. And in many ways, your AGM can be over and done with in 20 minutes, right? You need to have three resolutions. Most co-ops don't necessarily have to have elections because they have an acclamation, and then you have the procedural stuff. And in many ways, it can happen very quickly, especially if things are going good. People don't have questions. No one's pissed off. Everyone got a patronage dividend. If things are going good, it might be over and done in 20 minutes. But why not take that opportunity and add a little extra value for your co-op's membership? What else could you do in addition to the formal meeting? So one no-brainer, of course, is a Q&A. Make time for the members to ask the directors questions so they can better understand the annual report, they can better understand the operations, and they can better understand maybe how to get involved with the co-op. One thing we used to do at an organization I was involved with is we would always line up a guest speaker. So someone who would come in and talk about something relevant for the membership. We worked with a lot of seniors, so we would often have folks come in to talk about diabetes, safety in your home life, or things like programming that's available in the community. We'd often have counselors come and share information. Similarly, if you're maybe a worker-owned co-op or a producer co-op where it's tied a little more to your livelihood, why not arrange for some professional development, some skills training for your membership? Again, really adding some value for the members of the co-op. And then your co-op is an opportunity for your members to come together. Often it's the only time members of a co-op will come together in their full number. And you look at the year in review, and in many ways, you celebrate. So why not make a little bit of a celebration out of it? And what's the best way to celebrate than with some food? So why not have, a dinner, some finger food, a little time for socializing, and have a little bit of a party to follow that formal business of the co-op. I think it's time well spent because, again, it allows members to engage with each other, with the board, in a more informal, relaxed setting. And kind of hearkening back to one of those questions earlier, be mindful of the options available to your members to participate. Obviously, since the pandemic, most of our lives have shifted online. So it's almost expected, I would say, that if you're holding an annual general meeting, that there's likely to be some sort of online component that allow members to participate in that way. And as a board, it's up to you. Check your bylaws, check your rules, make sure you can, but find the system that you feel will work best for your membership, and then be very clear about how to communicate that with your membership. There's a million things to note with that. We do have a blog that helps folks with AGM planning during COVID. Because of course, things like Zoom, where we have open participation, is running well today. But if you've got a contentious issue, you don't want to have someone constantly muting people if there's an issue. So be mindful of the risks associated with online formats. Similarly, do check your bylaws or your rules around things like mail-in options, proxy voting, or early voting. I would recommend, if you want to entertain those sorts of things, which is perfectly fine, especially when it comes to elections, having a vote in the run-up is being adopted by lots of organizations. I would recommend putting those into your bylaws. So if you currently don't have something like that, I'd recommend having a resolution to amend the bylaws to allow for some of those processes. And then again, seek feedback from your members. Get a sense of how would you like to participate? Would you come out to an in-person meeting? Would you if there's food? Or do you really want to have something online that would allow you to participate? So be mindful of the systems that you're using. Make sure if you are using software that it matches any risks or inclusive ideas that you want to uphold, but do be mindful as a board. And then after the AGM, follow up. Try and follow up quickly. Usually AGMs are a really good high point for member engagement and interest in the affairs of the co-op. If you can, try and facilitate a continuation of that and ride that wave. Follow up fairly soon after with the membership, just maybe with an overview or a quick report. Doesn't have to be the full minutes, but just give a quick summary of here's what was discussed, here's who was elected, we celebrated these things. If you didn't make it, you're well informed. If you did make it, go us. Share some results, some photos, some discussion on social media. Keep the conversation about the co-op going. In many ways, your AGM is a bit of a transition. You're recapping what happened in this past year, but you're also looking forward at the whole year ahead of you. What do you need from members to make this coming year even more successful than the past year? Keep that conversation alive. Keep the momentum that you built at your AGM going, and share that with your membership. You may have also gotten some direction from members. You may have had, say, a special resolution. You may have had an amalgamation. You may have had big turnover on the board. You may have some new ideas that you're considering. Share that with the membership. If you've got some big action items coming out of your AGM, share that with your board. Let them know, hey, we've got this plan for the coming year. If you want to get involved, here's how. Keep that conversation alive, keep it going, and let the members know what's going on. Okay, before we get into another Q&A, I did want to share a couple of resources with folks. If your AGM is around the corner, check these out. It may make things a little bit easier. Namely, the Co-op Creator. If you follow this QR code, it'll take you to the Co-op Creator, and there you're going to find a whole heap of tools, resources, templates, how-to guides, in particular for AGMs. All of those that I've listed there, you can find there. So if you're needing some help with that, if you've got some questions around minute taking at the AGM, if you're not sure what to put in your minute book, check out some of those. Have a look. And similarly, if there's anything else that you're looking for, maybe things around an election, bylaw amendments, or managing the finances, there's a search bar at the top of the Co-op Creator. Search for whatever you're looking for. I'd be surprised if we didn't have it. But if you can't find it on the Co-op Creator, shoot me an email. Let me know. Because either we've got it in the works, or there's another organization I could probably link you to that would have something similar. So check it out. Check out the Co-op Creator. We add new things pretty regularly. Next, I would recommend, if you're interested, if it's your first time on the board of a co-op, or if you're expecting to bring on some more folks at your AGM to join the board of directors, there is some free online learning on our website. Lots of folks have gone through our Good Governance Matters course. It's really good if you want to really deep dive into co-op governance. We've also just released a brand new course called Introduction to Cooperative Law. If you want kind of the Coles notes of co-op legislation and what sets co-ops apart from other sorts of businesses, it's a great resource for that. And then if folks are interested in learning a bit more about Indigenous peoples, Indigenous history, and rights in Canada from a co-op leader's perspective, we released that course last year, Indigenous Awareness for Co-op Leaders. I would recommend checking it out. Folks in Saskatoon may be familiar with John Lajmadair and Winston McLean. They're phenomenal. They lead the course. But what I'd really recommend for folks, especially if you're new to the co-op board, is our Introduction to Co-ops course, and in particular, our Co-op Professionals Certificate. You can get a pretty quick overview of what it means to be a co-op, to do business as a co-op, and then good insights into the membership, operations, and governance of cooperatives and how all of that works together to make the business successful. And that's what that QR code will link to, is our Co-op Professionals course. All right. Well, thank you everyone for sticking it out with us. We made really good time. I'm more than happy to stick around and answer any questions. If you do have to run because we are 5 to the hour, I totally understand. A recording will be sent to you in the next couple of days. But I do want to say thank you all for coming out. I appreciate the questions so far. If you have any more, feel free to stay on the line or shoot us an email. But regardless, I would recommend scanning this QR code to sign up to our mailing list. We send out resources every quarter for co-op startups with lots of the resources that we talked about, as well as new ones that we're putting out, including on occasion grant funds that are good to know about. So lots of good stuff in our newsletter. Okay, any questions? Oh, I do see some stuff going on in the chat. Don't see any questions per se. Just lots of thanks. Oh, question from Sandra. If you don't have many members, can you use non-members in committees, etc.? Technically, yes. Depending on what's in your rules of association or your bylaws, always check that first. You can even have non-members on your board in some cases, and most provinces will limit the number that you can. But in many ways, a non-member on a committee is kind of just like a service provider. But I would recommend drafting up some sort of agreement, be it an NDA or something like that, because the board of a co-op have a fiduciary duty to the co-op. The members don't, and non-members certainly don't. So be mindful that you may want some legal coverage just to make sure that people are going to have the same standards that your board of directors are bringing to the table. So something like that, a committee agreement or an NDA or something like that should cover you off. But yes, certainly fine. Yeah. Any other questions? If folks want to unmute and ask a question, by all means, that's more than welcome as well. Okay.
Kyle, do you
Yeah.
have any suggestions for broaching or dealing with contentious subjects?
You know, I could probably talk all day about such things and have some enough personal experience. Because if you're on a board long enough, you'll have to deal with something really contentious at some point. it's usually unavoidable. Head on, honestly, is how I recommend it. Depending on the nature of it, I would recommend various levels of board confidentiality. Because again, there are certain things, especially if it's HR related, that you don't want to have a conversation about in a public setting, even if that is just the AGM. So be mindful of the confidentiality and the sensitivity of information in a contentious issue, because boards, of course, can go in camera. They don't have to share their records. So always be mindful of that. If there's a contentious issue that's happening at the AGM, and this certainly happens a lot, things like labor disputes, disagreement over, finances, anything like that, I would recommend not necessarily avoiding it and sticking it out. If folks are bringing, contentious questions to the board, make space, have that conversation, but do make sure that you're well prepared. I've been through a handful of those sorts of situations, but again, usually if you're in that situation, you as a board should have done the legwork to anticipate the risks of different sorts of decisions. So make sure that if there is some sort of murmuring happening amongst the membership, that you understand the issue and you're prepared to speak about it. So do the homework, but I wouldn't shy away from conflict, because it'll happen one way or the other. So it's better that you get ahead of it and be prepared for it than it sneak up on you. Yeah. Any other questions from folks? These are great.
Kyle.
Yeah.
Norm Lavoie calling. My question isn't about your presentation, but because a lot of the other people are involved with cooperatives, we are faced with the circumstance. What's coming due is our director's insurance, and we have a very small co-op with about $250,000 in assets, pretty much cash, and we haven't really done any business in the last year. And our director's insurance runs $5,000 for 5 directors, and a very, very small co-op, and so it's coming due here March 23rd again, and it just irks me that I got to write a check for $5,000 again for something that I don't anticipate we would even need. But what's the experience with directors insurance for some of the other people that are attending? Do they have it? Don't they? Have they found a place that it's a little more reasonably priced? Because I thought that was quite a bit of money. But
that's a great question, Norm. And I will say too, I mean, in all the co-ops we work with, we often recommend directors insurance as a nice to have. It isn't a need to have. Usually there's a timing associated with the insurance that you take on, because of course for your first year, often you're handling no money. And so it's not necessary to have that insurance. But once you get towards operations and the risk to the co-op goes up, then it's unavoidable. And the price of director's insurance does vary a lot, I will say. In organizations I've been involved with, and again, your insurance provider will make that call on what level of risk the business operates under, and what price puts their mind at ease. In many cases, it's very low, but in some cases, it can be surprisingly high. So it's kind of an assessment of the risk of the co-op's business model.
yeah.
But also for that reason, it wouldn't hurt to put out an RFP or seek proposals from different insurance providers routinely. The cooperators is who I've worked with the most, mostly because they have a full package built for co-ops called Co-op Guard, including general commercial liability, D&O and director and officer liability insurance, and then it can also provide on the back end HR benefits. It's a good one-stop shop, and you can usually get good savings if you've got multiple services with them. But they do, of course, still have the same risk assessment. I've just found that they've also been easier to talk with.
What are they called again, Kyle?
The cooperators.
Okay,
Yeah.
the cooperators, yeah, because I didn't make the original inquiry, but someone did for us, and they had a difficult time finding any insurance company that would even consider it.
Yeah.
And it took us quite a while, almost like 7 months, to find somebody that was prepared to do it. And so we did it, and I just found it to be quite Oh, but,
No, it's one of those things. And again, I would say the reason I like cooperators is they seem to be more willing to have a conversation with boards. Everyone I've worked with at the cooperators we've worked with here, they're willing to have an agent come out, have a conversation, do a walkthrough if you have property, and talk about the risks to the co-op. And then also have a frank conversation about what controls you can put in place as a board. Because really, they're worried that, for D&O insurance, the director is going to cause some sort of liability or cost that they're
Do you
going
have
to
a contact name there?
So they have
You
local
could-
offices,
Okay.
but yeah, we can
Can
follow
you
up
email
on
me
that.
one? Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. But I do see in the chat here, some folks are having the same question. Do we need it? Some have it and it's expensive. It varies from place to place for sure. And again, if your co-op, is very low risk, lots of organizations will operate without director and officer liability insurance. But it's a call that the board needs to make, and they do so by being fully aware of the risks to the co-op. Yeah. Any other questions from folks? All good?
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming out. Thank you for your questions. They were fantastic. We will be following up in the next couple of days with the recording. If you have any questions between now and then, feel free to shoot me an email. If you sign up for our newsletter, you may get some cool stuff around the corner anyway. But thank you all for spending the afternoon with me. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll chat soon.
Thanks, Kyle. It was great.
Thank you.